What if I told you that a 1960s housewife could throw a picture-perfect Christmas for her entire family on less than what you'd spend on a single shopping trip today? She didn't have credit cards, she didn't have online deals, and she certainly didn't have buy now, pay later apps. Yet somehow, she managed to wrap gifts under a glowing tree, serve a feast that would make your mouth water, and keep her family smiling through the entire holiday season, all while staying within a budget so tight it would make modern financial advisors weep with admiration. It wasn't magic, it was method. And what she knew about managing Christmas finances would shock you. Let me take you back to December 1960. The snow is falling softly outside a modest ranch-style home in suburban America. Inside, a housewife named Margaret sits at her kitchen table under the warm glow of a single overhead bulb. Spread before her are envelopes, plain white envelopes, each one carefully labeled in her neat cursive handwriting. Gifts, food, decorations, church donation, emergency fund. Each envelope contains cash, crisp bills that represent weeks of careful planning, strategic shopping, and a level of financial discipline that most of us can't even imagine today. But here's what you need to understand. Margaret isn't wealthy. Her husband works at the local factory, bringing home about $95 a week. After the mortgage, utilities, car payment, and weekly groceries, there isn't much left over. Yet Margaret will pull off Christmas for herself, her husband, and their 3 children without going into debt, without panicking, and without sacrificing the magic of the season. How did she do it? That's the story we're about to uncover. The first secret, and this one will surprise you, started all the way back in January. That's right, the 1960s housewife didn't wait until Black Friday or even until December to think about Christmas finances. She started planning the day after New Year's. On January 2nd, 1960, Margaret sat down with a notebook and did something that would be considered absolutely revolutionary today. She calculated exactly what Christmas had cost her the previous year. She knew, down to the penny, what she'd spent on each child's gifts, how much the Christmas turkey had been, what she'd paid for wrapping paper and ribbon, the cost of the stamps for Christmas cards, even how much extra she'd spent on electricity running those outdoor lights every evening. She wrote it all down. Then she looked at that number and asked herself the question that would guide her entire year. How can I do this better? But Margaret didn't stop there. She took that total amount and divided it by 50 weeks. Why 50? Because she gave herself 2 weeks of breathing room, 2 weeks where she wouldn't have to worry about setting aside Christmas money. That weekly amount, let's say it came to about $3, would be her Christmas savings deposit every single week. Here's where it gets fascinating. Margaret didn't keep that money in a regular savings account. She joined something that most people today have never even heard of. A Christmas club. Nearly every bank and credit union in America offered these special savings accounts in the 1960s. You deposit a set amount every week or every month, and the account would mature in early December, just in time for holiday shopping. The genius part? You couldn't withdraw the money early without a penalty. It forced discipline in a way that our modern savings apps, with their instant transfers and one-click withdrawals, simply can't replicate. But let's say Margaret deposited $3 every week into her Christmas club starting in mid-January. By the first week of December, she'd have saved $150, and that's before we even talk about her other strategies. In 1960 dollars, that was serious money. To put it in perspective, that $150 had the purchasing power of about $1,500 today. And she'd done it without feeling the pinch, without taking out a loan, without putting a single purchase on credit. Have you ever tried saving for Christmas this way, starting right after the holidays to plan for the next one? It sounds almost impossible in our instant gratification world, doesn't it? Now, Margaret's Christmas Club savings was just the foundation. The real genius came in how she stretched every single dollar once December arrived. And this is where the 1960s housewives' financial creativity truly shined. You see, Margaret didn't just save money. She multiplied it through sheer resourcefulness. Let's start with gifts. In 1960, the average American family spent about $75 on Christmas presents for everyone: children, extended family, friends, teachers, the mailman, neighbors. That might not sound like much, but remember, $75 had real weight back then. Margaret had to make it work for everyone on her list, which included 3 children, ranging from ages 6 to 12, both sets of grandparents, her husband, 2 sisters, a brother, her children's teachers, and about half a dozen neighbors and friends who'd be exchanging gifts. So what did she do? She started shopping in July. Yes, July. While her neighbors were planning summer barbecues and beach trips, Margaret was scanning the newspaper for mid-year clearance sales. Department stores like JCPenney, Sears, and Montgomery Ward would have massive inventory reductions in late summer, trying to clear out space for fall merchandise. This is when Margaret struck. She'd find toys marked down to half price or less, clothing on clearance racks, household items being discontinued. She'd buy them, bring them home, and hide them in the back of the hallway closet, wrapped in brown paper bags to keep them a secret from curious children. But here's what made Margaret different from someone just shopping early. She kept a detailed list. In her purse, she carried a small spiral notebook where she'd written every single person's name, their interests, clothing sizes, and potential gift ideas. When she found that wooden train set marked down from $8 to $3.50 in August, she'd check her list, see that it was perfect for her youngest son, Tommy, and buy it on the spot. Then she'd write down the purchase in her notebook. Tommy, wooden train, $3.50. This way, she never overspent, never bought duplicates, and never had that December panic of realizing she'd forgotten someone. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, Margaret had already purchased about 80% of her Christmas gifts, and she'd spent roughly half of what she'd budgeted. The remaining money? That became her cushion for fresh food, unexpected needs, and perhaps 1 or 2 special splurges. Let's talk about homemade gifts for a moment, because this is where the 1960s housewife really separated herself from modern holiday shoppers. Today, we might give a homemade gift and apologize for it, as if it's somehow less valuable than something store-bought. But in 1960, homemade gifts were prized. They were personal, thoughtful, and they saved a tremendous amount of money. Margaret spent her autumn evenings creating. While her husband watched Bonanza or the Andy Griffith Show in the living room, she'd sit at the kitchen table with her supplies spread around her. For her mother-in-law, she'd crochet a delicate doily using thread she'd purchased for 35 cents. It would take her about 3 weeks of evening work, but the result would be something beautiful, something that would be displayed proudly and treasured for decades. The equivalent store-bought doily would have cost $3 or $4, nearly 10 times what she'd spent on materials. For her sisters, she made aprons using fabric remnants she'd bought at the Five and Dime for less than $1 per yard. These weren't simple aprons, mind you. Margaret would add rickrack trim, decorative pockets, maybe even embroider their initials on the bib. Each apron represented hours of work, but the material cost was minimal. Her sisters would receive these gifts and genuinely treasure them, wearing them throughout the year and thinking of Margaret every time they tied them on. For neighbors and teachers, Margaret had discovered the power of food gifts. In early December, she'd spend one full Saturday baking. The house would smell like heaven: vanilla, cinnamon, nutmeg, butter, sugar. She'd make dozens of cookies, Russian tea cakes rolled in powdered sugar, fudge that she'd cut into perfect squares and wrap in wax paper, peanut brittle cooled on cookie sheets and broken into rustic pieces, and her special recipe for cinnamon swirl bread that everyone raved about. The cost? Astonishingly low. A 5-pound bag of flour cost about 50 cents. Sugar was about 30 cents for 5 pounds. Butter was 65 cents per pound, and she'd use maybe 2 pounds for an entire day of baking. Even with eggs, vanilla extract, and nuts, her total investment would be under $5. But from that $5, she'd produce enough baked goods to create 25 to 30 gifts. She'd pack them in small tins that she'd saved throughout the year, the ones that had held store-bought cookies or candies, lined with wax paper and tied with ribbon she'd bought on clearance for a nickel per roll. What's the most creative homemade gift you've ever given or received? Could you imagine spending your December evenings the way Margaret did, creating instead of clicking Add to Cart? Let's not forget the children's gifts, because this is where Margaret's strategy gets even more interesting. Today, kids are bombarded with advertisements for the latest toys, video games, and electronics. The pressure on parents to deliver these expensive items can be crushing. But in 1960, children's expectations were different. Not because kids wanted less, but because the entire culture of consumerism hadn't yet reached its fever pitch. Margaret's children would each receive about 3 or 4 gifts from Santa, and maybe 1 or 2 from their parents. The Santa gifts were the toys, that wooden train for Tommy, a baby doll with a complete wardrobe that Margaret had sewn herself for 8-year-old Susan, and a chemistry set for 12-year-old Bobby. The parental gifts were practical: new pajamas, socks, maybe a book or a board game the whole family could play together. But here's the brilliant part. Margaret made Christmas morning look abundant. She understood the visual psychology of gift giving. Instead of wrapping each item of clothing separately, which would cost more in paper and take up more space under the tree, she'd combine practical items strategically. But she'd also include lots of small, inexpensive items that would make the pile look impressive. A package of colored pencils, 15 cents. A small notepad, 10 cents. A harmonica, 65 cents. A yo-yo, 35 cents. A set of jacks, 20 cents. Or a small stuffed animal from the Five and Dime, 98 cents. When Christmas morning arrived, each child would have a respectable pile to unwrap. They'd feel abundant, loved, thoroughly spoiled. But Margaret would have spent maybe $15 to $20 per child total, well within her budget. She'd also revived a tradition that many families had abandoned: the Christmas stocking. Margaret didn't buy those overpriced pre-filled stockings from the department store. She made the stockings herself, using felt and simple embroidery. Then she filled them with items that cost pennies but delighted her children: a tangerine, exotic in winter; a handful of walnuts still in their shells; a candy cane; a small toy from the dime store; maybe a shiny new penny or a silver dollar for their piggy banks. The total cost of filling 3 stockings? Less than $2. The joy on Christmas. Now let's shift our attention to something that consumed a huge portion of modern Christmas budgets: decorations. Today, people spend hundreds of dollars on outdoor light displays, inflatable lawn decorations, elaborate indoor arrangements, and designer ornaments. The pressure to have an Instagram-worthy Christmas display is real and expensive. Margaret's approach to decorations would shock most modern families. Her total decoration budget? About $5. Maybe $6 if she felt extravagant. But somehow, her home looked like a Christmas wonderland. How? First, she worked with what she had. Margaret had a box of ornaments that had been accumulated over years. Some were wedding gifts, some had been her mother's, some the children had made in school, and yes, a few had been purchased at after-Christmas clearance sales for 10 or 15 cents each. Every year, she'd add just 2 or 3 new ornaments, choosing ones that were meaningful rather than trendy. These ornaments told the story of her family. The tree itself was real, of course. Artificial trees existed, but were expensive and considered a bit tacky in 1960. Margaret's husband would take the children to a local lot where trees were sold for about $3 to $5, depending on size. This was an event, a tradition. The children would walk among the trees, debating the merits of each one until they found the perfect tree. Her husband would negotiate a bit with the seller, maybe getting $1 off if the tree had a thin spot that could be turned toward the wall. Once that tree was home and set up in its stand, a simple metal contraption that cost about $1 and would last for decades, the real decorating began. Margaret didn't buy garland from the store. She made it. She'd save eggshells throughout the year, crushing them into small pieces. In December, she'd string these on thread with cranberries and popcorn to create beautiful, natural garland that cost literally nothing. The children would help with this, sitting around the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, threading their needles carefully while Christmas carols played on the radio. For the top of the tree, Margaret didn't buy an expensive angel or star. She had a star made from cardboard covered in aluminum foil that had been in the family for years. It was bent in a few places, the foil was wrinkled, but it was their star, and it wouldn't have been Christmas without it. Window decorations were equally resourceful. Margaret would cut snowflakes from white paper, intricate designs that she'd learned as a girl. She'd tape these to the windows, and when the light shone through them, they created beautiful shadows. For the front door, she'd make a wreath using branches clipped from the evergreen bushes in her yard, wiring them onto a coat hanger she'd bent into a circle. A red ribbon from the fabric store, 20 cents. Maybe some pine cones the children had collected on an autumn walk. And her wreath looked as good as anything in the stores, which were selling similar wreaths for $3 to $5. The mantelpiece would be decorated with candles she already owned, surrounded by more evergreen branches and perhaps a small nativity set that had been a wedding gift. The scent of fresh pine filled the house, free and wonderful. Outside, the decorations were minimal but effective. A string of colored lights across the front of the house, one string, nothing elaborate. These lights, which Margaret and her husband had purchased several years ago for about $4, were used carefully. She wouldn't turn them on until after dark, and she'd switch them off before bedtime. Electricity cost money, after all, and every penny counted. Do you remember when Christmas decorations were simple like this? When a single strand of lights and a homemade wreath were enough to make a house feel festive? But perhaps the most expensive part of Christmas, then and now, was the food. A Christmas feast with all the trimmings could devastate a budget if not carefully managed. This is where Margaret's weekly routine throughout the year paid off in spectacular fashion. You see, Margaret had been preparing for Christmas dinner since summer. No, she hadn't been cooking and freezing turkey in July, though she did freeze some things, but she'd been strategically shopping and preserving. When green beans were at their peak in July and selling for pennies a pound at the farm stand, Margaret bought 20 pounds. She spent an entire day blanching and freezing them. When cranberries appeared in November, she'd bought several extra bags and stashed them in her freezer. Sweet potatoes, onions, celery, whenever these items went on sale, Margaret bought extra and stored them properly. By December, her pantry and freezer contained most of what she'd need for Christmas dinner. The only fresh items she'd need to buy were the turkey, fresh rolls from the bakery, and perhaps some dairy. Let's talk about that turkey for a moment. In 1960, a turkey cost about 35 cents per pound. A decent 12-pound bird would run about $4.20. But Margaret didn't pay full price. She never paid full price. Here's what she did. Starting in early November, Margaret began shopping strategically at different grocery stores. This was before the era of one-stop shopping, when housewives would visit multiple stores to get the best deals. Each store had its own specialties and sales. A&P might have the best price on canned goods, while the local butcher had better meat prices, and Piggly Wiggly was running a special on produce. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, grocery stores would compete for customers by offering loss leader deals on turkeys. Margaret would watch the newspaper ads like a hawk. When she saw that Kroger was offering turkeys for 19 cents per pound if you bought $25 worth of groceries, she'd plan her entire weekly shopping around that deal. She was going to spend $25 on groceries that week anyway. Might as well get the discounted turkey. But she didn't stop there. Some stores offered a free turkey if you purchased a certain amount over several weeks. Margaret would carefully save her register receipts, accumulating the required total, and then claim her free bird. If she ended up with 2 turkeys, one discounted and one free, even better. She'd cook them both, serve one for Christmas, and slice up the second one for sandwiches throughout the following week, making the most of her good fortune. The rest of the Christmas meal came together through similar strategic planning. Butter for the rolls and the mashed potatoes? She'd purchased several pounds back in September when it went on sale for 40 cents a pound instead of the usual 65 cents, and she'd frozen it. Flour for the pie crusts? Part of her regular 50-cent 5-pound bag purchase. Eggs? She had a neighbor with chickens who sold them for less than the store. For the pies, and there would be several, pumpkin, apple, and mincemeat, Margaret would make the crusts herself. Pre-made pie crusts didn't really exist in 1960, but even if they had, Margaret wouldn't have bought them. Why pay someone else to mix flour, shortening, and water? She could do that herself in 10 minutes. The pumpkin came from a can that she'd bought on sale in October for 12 cents. The apples came from her neighbor's tree. They'd traded apples for a batch of Margaret's famous oatmeal cookies. The mincemeat pie was special because Margaret made the mincemeat herself from a recipe her grandmother had given her. She'd prepared it weeks in advance, letting it age and develop flavor. The ingredients had cost maybe 75 cents total, but the result was a pie that tasted like tradition, like heritage, like home. On Christmas Day, Margaret's dining table would groan under the weight of the feast. The golden brown turkey, its skin crispy and perfect. A mountain of fluffy mashed potatoes with a well of melted butter on top. Sweet potato casserole topped with the few mini marshmallows she'd allowed herself to buy. Green beans almondine, though she'd substituted regular beans for French and used slivered almonds she'd chopped herself to save money. Homemade cranberry sauce that actually tasted like cranberries instead of the canned jelly rings. Warm rolls that her husband would slather with butter, and those 3 beautiful pies for dessert. The total cost of this magnificent meal? About $12, including the turkey. $12 to feed her family and possibly a few guests, creating a feast that would be remembered and talked about for months afterward. Compare that to today, when the average American family spends well over $150 on their Christmas meal, and you begin to understand the financial wizardry of the 1960s housewife. Have you ever tried planning a holiday meal this strategically? Starting months in advance, watching for sales, preserving and freezing ingredients? Now let's discuss an aspect of Christmas finances that often gets overlooked: the hidden costs. These are the little expenses that add up quickly and can destroy even a well-planned budget. Things like Christmas cards, postage, wrapping paper, ribbon, tape, batteries for toys, and all those miscellaneous items that seem small individually but become significant collectively. Margaret had a system for these too, of course. Christmas cards were a non-negotiable part of 1960s life. You sent cards to everyone: family, friends, neighbors, your husband's coworkers, old classmates, your children's teachers from previous years. Margaret's card list included about 75 names. At the store, a box of 20 Christmas cards cost anywhere from 98 cents to $2, depending on quality. If Margaret bought 4 boxes of decent cards, she'd spend about $6. Then she'd need 75 stamps at 4 cents each, adding another $3. We were already at $9 just for Christmas greetings. But Margaret found ways to reduce even this expense. First, she bought her cards at after-Christmas sales the previous year, getting them for half price or better. Second, she didn't send cards to everyone. Some people got a handwritten note or a photo Christmas card that she made herself using a photo from the local drugstore's developing service and blank cardstock. Third, she hand-delivered cards whenever possible, saving the postage. If she was going to see someone at church or at a neighborhood gathering, why pay 4 cents to mail it? For wrapping paper, Margaret's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. She saved everything. Brown paper bags from the grocery store were carefully cut open, flattened, and stored. These became wrapping paper. She'd dress them up with homemade stamps cut from potatoes. The children loved helping with this, dipped in poster paint. Suddenly, that plain brown paper became festive and personalized. Newspaper comics pages also became wrapping paper, something that was actually quite stylish at the time. Old maps from the gas station, the Sunday newspaper's magazine insert with its colorful photographs, all of these became creative wrapping solutions. When she did buy actual wrapping paper, it was always at the after-Christmas sales the previous year. She'd pay perhaps 10 cents for a roll that had been selling for 50 cents in December. She'd buy several rolls, store them carefully in a dry place, and she'd be set for the next year. Ribbon was never purchased new. Margaret saved every piece of ribbon that came on gifts, carefully smoothing out wrinkles and rolling it for reuse. She saved the decorative bows, too, flattening them gently and storing them in a box. That fancy velvet bow that came on a gift from her mother-in-law, it would appear on 3 or 4 different gifts over the next several years before it finally wore out. Tape was used sparingly. Margaret had perfected the art of folding and tucking paper so that it needed only 1 or 2 small pieces of tape to secure it. She'd make a roll of Scotch tape last for months. Even batteries were part of her strategy. When toys needed batteries, and several did in 1960 as battery-operated toys were becoming popular, Margaret wouldn't just buy them at the store. She'd wait and watch for sales, buying them in November when stores ran pre-Christmas specials. A package of 4D batteries might cost 65 cents at regular price, but could be found for 40 cents during a sale. All of these small savings added up. Where a less strategic shopper might spend $25 or $30 on these miscellaneous Christmas items, Margaret kept it under $10. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Margaret's Christmas financial management wasn't what she spent, it was what she didn't spend. There were entire categories of modern Christmas expenses that simply didn't exist in her world. And understanding this reveals just how much holiday spending has inflated beyond actual needs. Margaret didn't spend money on professional gift wrapping services, pre-lit artificial trees, matching ornament sets from designer brands, elaborate outdoor decorations, Christmas-themed throw pillows, dish towels, and seasonal home decor that would be used for 4 weeks and stored for 48. Expensive holiday outfits worn once, catered meals or takeout dinners during the busy season, shipping costs for online orders, gift bags and tissue paper, Christmas music streaming services or special downloads, holiday photo sessions with professional photographers, matching family pajamas for Christmas morning photos, advent calendars with toys or expensive chocolates. The list goes on. These are all things that modern families often feel pressured to purchase, adding hundreds of dollars to their Christmas costs. Margaret didn't feel deprived by not having them. They simply weren't part of how Christmas was done. Instead, Margaret invested her time and creativity. She couldn't buy her way to a perfect Christmas. Her budget wouldn't allow it, so she had to create her way there. And in many ways, the result was richer, more meaningful, more memorable. Let's talk about the social aspects of Christmas finances in 1960, because this was another area where the housewife had to navigate carefully. There were expectations, obligations, and opportunities for spending that could derail even the best-laid budget. Neighborhood gift exchanges were common. The ladies on Margaret Street had an informal tradition of exchanging small gifts. Nothing expensive, usually homemade treats or inexpensive items from the dime store, but still, it was 7 or 8 gifts that needed to be purchased or made. Margaret handled this by hosting a cookie exchange party in early December. Each neighbor would bring several dozen cookies, and everyone would go home with a beautiful assortment. This solved the gift problem while also providing treats for Margaret's own holiday entertaining. Cost to Margaret? Just the ingredients for her cookies, which she'd make anyway. Church obligations were another consideration. The Christmas offering was important, and Margaret felt strongly about contributing. She and her husband had budgeted $5 for this. Not a huge amount,
but meaningful on their income. Margaret also volunteered to bake cookies for the church's Christmas social, which saved the church from having to purchase desserts, while allowing Margaret to contribute in a way that didn't strain her budget.
Then there were the children's school Christmas parties. Each child was expected to bring treats to share, and there were often gift exchanges organized by the teachers. Margaret handled the treats by making popcorn balls, simple, inexpensive, and always popular. She'd wrap them individually in wax paper and tie them with red yarn. For the gift exchanges, which usually had a dollar limit, she'd shop carefully at the 5 and dime, finding appropriate gifts for 50 to 75 cents each. Margaret also had to think about her husband's work obligations. His company would host a Christmas party in mid-December, and while the event itself was free, there was an expectation that everyone would contribute a dish to the potluck. Margaret would make her famous potato salad, or perhaps a green bean casserole, something substantial that fed a lot of people without costing much. The ingredients might run $2, but her husband's presence at the party with a well-regarded dish helped maintain his standing with coworkers and bosses. Do you think modern families could benefit from some of these old-fashioned money-saving approaches? Or has our world changed too much? There was another aspect to Margaret's financial management that we need to discuss: the concept of making do versus buying new. This philosophy permeated every aspect of her Christmas preparation and reflected a fundamental difference between 1960s culture and today's disposable society. When Margaret needed something, her first thought was never, "Where can I buy this?" It was, "How can I make this work with what I already have?" For example, when her daughter Susan mentioned wanting a dollhouse for Christmas, Margaret didn't head to the toy store to buy one of the expensive pre-made dollhouses that sold for $15 to $20. Instead, she talked to her husband. Over several evenings in his basement workshop, he constructed a simple 3-room dollhouse from scrap plywood and lumber he had left over from other projects. The cost? Maybe $2 for some additional wood, a few nails, and sandpaper. Margaret then took over, painting the house, creating wallpaper from contact paper samples she'd gotten free from the hardware store, and making tiny curtains from fabric scraps. She crafted furniture from matchboxes, spools of thread, and pieces of cardboard. A thimble became a lamp. A bottle cap became a mirror. A matchstick wrapped in fabric became a rolling pin for the dollhouse kitchen. The entire project cost less than $5 and represented weeks of evening work. But on Christmas morning, when Susan unwrapped that dollhouse, her eyes went wide with wonder. It wasn't just a toy. It was a house that Daddy had built with his hands, that Mommy had decorated with love. It was absolutely unique. No other child in the world had one exactly like it. This wasn't unusual. This was normal. Fathers built wagons and sleds in their workshops. Mothers sewed doll clothes and stuffed animals. Grandparents carved wooden toys or knitted elaborate gifts. The investment of time and skill was considered more valuable than money spent at a store. Margaret's approach to Christmas finances represented something that we've largely lost in our modern world: the integration of financial planning with family life and values. Her budget wasn't just a spreadsheet or a list of numbers. It was a reflection of what mattered to her family. She saved money not out of stinginess, but out of necessity and wisdom. She knew that going into debt for Christmas, spending January and February paying off December's purchases, would cast a shadow over those winter months. The bills would arrive just when everyone was feeling post-holiday blues, and the strain would affect her marriage, her mood, and her children's sense of security. By staying within her carefully planned budget, Margaret gave her family something more valuable than an abundance of expensive gifts. She gave them peace. Peace of mind, peace in the home, peace at the start of the new year. But there was something else Margaret understood, something that our credit card-driven consumer culture has obscured: the difference between celebration and consumption. Christmas, for Margaret, was about celebration, of faith, of family, of tradition, of community. It wasn't about consumption, about acquiring more things, showing off,
keeping up with neighbors, or proving love through expensive presents. This distinction shaped every decision she made. When she spent hours making aprons for her sisters, instead of buying them something quick from the department store, she was choosing celebration over consumption. When she planned meals around what was on sale and in season, rather than buying specialty items at premium prices, she was choosing celebration over consumption. When she let her children help with baking and decorating, instead of keeping them distracted while she did everything herself, she was choosing celebration over consumption. The results spoke for themselves. Margaret's children grew up with warm, rich memories of Christmas. They remembered making popcorn garland at the kitchen table. They remembered shopping for the tree with Daddy. They remembered helping Mommy bake cookies and being allowed to lick the spoon. They remembered the excitement of Christmas morning, the joy of unwrapping treasures, the abundance they felt, even though the gifts weren't numerous or expensive. Most importantly, they learned lessons that would serve them throughout their lives. They learned that careful planning and discipline could make dreams happen. They learned that creativity and resourcefulness were valuable skills. They learned that time and attention were more precious than money. They learned that delayed gratification, saving up for something, planning for it, working toward it, made the achievement sweeter. These weren't lessons Margaret sat down and taught formally. They were simply absorbed, day by day, as her children watched her manage the household with skill and grace. Can we bring any of this back? In our world of two-income households, Amazon Prime, and credit card debt, can we recapture even a fraction of what Margaret knew? I believe we can, but it requires a fundamental shift in thinking. It requires rejecting the marketing messages that tell us we need to spend money to show love. It requires planning ahead instead of impulse buying. It requires valuing time and creativity as much as convenience. It requires being willing to be different, to opt out of the spending arms race that many of our neighbors are caught up in. Imagine if you started planning next Christmas the day after this one. Imagine if you set aside even $20 a week in a separate account that you couldn't touch. By next December, you'd have saved over $1,000, and that's without implementing any of Margaret's other strategies. Now, add some of those strategies. Shop sales throughout the year. Make some gifts instead of buying everything. Scale back on decorations, focusing on what truly makes your home feel festive rather than trying to compete with elaborate displays. Plan your Christmas meal strategically, watching for sales and using what's in season. Cut back on the miscellaneous expenses that add up without adding value. The result? You could have a beautiful, memorable, meaningful Christmas without going into debt, without financial stress, without that sick feeling in January when the credit card bills arrive. But here's what I think is the most important lesson from Margaret's approach. Christmas doesn't have to be expensive to be magical. In fact, sometimes the magic increases as the expense decreases because you're forced to be creative, to be present, to invest yourself rather than just your money.
Margaret's children didn't feel deprived. They didn't know that the dollhouse was made from scrap wood or that their stockings were filled with inexpensive treats. They didn't care that the tree decorations were homemade or that the Christmas cards were purchased on clearance. What they knew was that their home was warm and festive, that good smells came from the kitchen, that their parents were happy and relaxed rather than stressed and fighting, and that Christmas morning brought delights that had been chosen thoughtfully for each of them. Isn't that what we all want? Not necessarily to recreate 1960, but to recapture that sense of peace, abundance, and joy that doesn't require maxing out credit cards or feeling financially stressed. Margaret's story, and the story of countless other 1960s housewives like her, reminds us that this is possible. It's not easy. It requires planning, discipline, creativity, and time. It requires going against the cultural current that tells us to buy now and worry about payment later. It requires being intentional about what we value and how we spend. But the rewards are substantial. Financial peace,
A Christmas season that feels joyful rather than stressful. Children who learn valuable lessons about money, planning, and resourcefulness. A home filled with love and celebration rather than expensive purchases that lose their appeal by New Year's. As we move further away from Margaret's era, as those of us who remember the simplicity of that time grow older, these lessons become even more important to preserve and share. Because somewhere in the transition from her world to ours, we lost something valuable. We gained convenience, certainly. We gained variety and access to products Margaret couldn't have imagined. But we lost the art of making do, the creativity born of constraint, the satisfaction of saving and planning and achieving. The question is, do we want it back? Which of these 1960s Christmas habits would you most like to bring back into your own holiday season? Starting to save in January? Making more gifts by hand? Simplifying decorations? Planning meals more strategically? I'll leave you with this thought. Margaret didn't have much money, but she had something arguably more valuable. She had a plan, she had creativity, and she had the discipline to execute her vision. She turned constraint into an opportunity for excellence, and in doing so, she created Christmases that her family remembered not for what was spent, but for what was shared. Maybe that's the real secret of how 1960s housewives managed Christmas finances so well. It wasn't just about the specific strategies, though those were brilliant. It was about the mindset, the belief that less could be more, that thoughtfulness mattered more than expense, and that the true magic of Christmas had nothing to do with how much money you spent and everything to do with the love and care you invested in making the season special. In our modern world of abundance and access, maybe that's the lesson we need most of all.